This week, our feature interview. Very excited about our feature interview with Steve Bellovin. He is a professor at Columbia University, but probably more well known in our circles as one of the original authors of Firewalls and Internet Security, as well as several other accolades. Then we will have a technical segment from audience favorite Sven from NetSparker, who'll be dropping some knowledge on web application security, or insecurity, as it were. In the security news for this week, I guess we'll talk a little bit about GDPR, maybe some VPN filter, Blue Team training, Pornhub launching VPN Hub, some very interesting, off-topic kind of stories that I had to throw in there just to mix things up a little bit. One I put in there specifically for Jack, which is why the older you get, the more you hate everyone, and why. So for all that and more, stay tuned for this episode of Paul's Security Weekly. This is Security Weekly, for security professionals, by security professionals. Broadcasting live from G-Unit Studios in Rhode Island, it's the show where exploits run wild, packets aren't the only things getting sniffed, and the cocktails flow steady. It's Paul's Security Weekly. Welcome. Does Larry have an introduction? Hi, everyone. This is Paul Asador, and I guess I'm introducing...
Apparently, I no longer do.
Okay.
Wow, and I look short.
So, I accidentally landed in New England and stumbled my way to the G-Unit studio.
That's pretty much how I envisioned it happening, Jeff. Carlos, save the show, please.
Yes, somebody's got to do it.
It cannot be saved.
Well, it's good to have you back, Carlos. Jeff, welcome. Nice to have you in studio.
It's great to be here, Paul. Try to stay awake for the whole episode.
Yes. We've been in studio dropping his phone incessantly. Welcome, Jack.
What? Where? Oh, hey! I'm in the studio with you guys. That's kind of cool.
NetSparker, the developers of desktop and cloud-based web application security scanners that enable you to automatically identify vulnerabilities in your web applications and web services. NetSparker scanners employ a unique and dead-accurate vulnerability scanning engine that automatically verifies vulnerabilities with their proof of concept. For more information, visit them on the web at netsparker.com or email at contact@netsparker.com. In 2017, an increasing number of companies reported they did not have effective insider threat detection methods. Logarithm's UEBA solutions enable you to detect and neutralize user-based threats in real time, while built-in scenario and behavior-based analytics empower you to expose insider threats, compromised accounts, and privilege misuse. Visit logarithm.com to learn how their UEBA solutions can help you expand visibility and enhance detection capabilities.
Hello and welcome to the show. But first, let me introduce you to our host. He's a man who orders his tacos on Thursday and puts the toilet paper over the back, not over the front. Paul Asadorian.
That's right. I'm a trend setter or trend breaker, I guess.
Or an asshole.
In this case. And it's weird. It's Taco Thursdays here in the office and Sushi Tuesdays. I guess we could probably switch those, but I don't know. Yeah, we'll work on it.
Way.
We buck the trends. I am very excited to be here. This is Paul Security Weekly, episode 561 for Thursday, May 24th, 2018. To my left here in studio is none other than Mr. Larry Pesce.
Yay!
Welcome, Larry. What's going on?
Jazz hands or something.
Jazz hands.
That's
get your jazz hands correct. On the lines via Skype, Mr. Jason Wood is with us. Jason, welcome.
Hey, everybody. Good to be here.
And still has the cover over his webcam, Carlos Perez has joined us this evening. Welcome, Carlos.
Hey, Paul. Happy to be here. In fact, I have no webcam on this rig.
Oh, no worries.
It's nighttime in Puerto Rico.
Again. Yes. He's conserving energy and power, as I'm sure you need to do in Puerto Rico, and hopefully things are improving there for you, Carlos.
Yep.
Also, on the lines via Skype, Mr. Joff Thayer is here with us this evening. Joff, welcome.
That would be me. G'day, everybody. How you doing? Great to be here again.
And someone we haven't seen in some time. We wonder where he's been, Mr. Jack Daniel. I think he wonders the same thing as well.
Where have I been? It's good to be back with you this evening, though.
Where haven't you been, Jack, in the past couple of months, I think?
There isn't a tag explicit enough to describe what I've been up to.
That's what we expect. A quick announcement. I encourage everyone to check out our on-demand material, securityweekly.com/on-demand. Make sure you go there, check out some of our previously recorded webcasts, including the most recent one, the State of Endpoint Security. I would now like to introduce our very special guest for this evening. We have Steve Bellovin from Columbia University, and many of you may know Steve from his various work in information security today. He holds several patents in the field, has received several awards, including the Usenix Lifetime Achievement Award. He is, of course, one of the co-authors for Firewalls and Internet Security, and his most recent book is Thinking Security. Steve, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me. Pleased to be here.
It's so nice of you to join us this evening, Steve. I'm very excited. I want to start by asking you how you got your start in information security.
Well, I have a long background in system administration, at this point more than 50 years worth. And in fact, I caught my first hackers about 1971.
Wow.
I was a place where I was working part-time. City College of New York. There were a couple of students I found poking around. The computer for the entire city university system was used for administrative and academic computing. When I found a couple of student programs poking at administrative files, I wasn't happy. This was back in the punch card days, so I could see what they were doing. And when I looked at it, one I hired, the other I sent to the dean.
Was that based on your own personal assessment of each individual?
Well, I was looking at what the files were. Were they trying to poke at something they shouldn't be poking at, or just trying to learn how the system worked?
Excuse me.
Yeah. But my real start on security came about 15 years later. I was one of the first people doing TCP/IP networking at Bell Labs. I owed 1.5 of the first 3 lanes of Ethernet cable in the entire 300,000 employee company. And as we started adding more individual labs to the network, sometimes things would break. In particular, the routing would break. And I said to myself, gee, if this could happen accidentally, what would happen if somebody did that on purpose? Oh my. So it was thinking from a system administration, network administration perspective, I realized there are all kinds of things that could go wrong. And that's how I got my start on security a bit over 30 years ago.
And now, Steve, some of your work across your career has been in routing protocols. Was that based on that early experience? And what has some of your work been in routing protocols?
Absolutely. Back in early mid-'80s, you didn't have dedicated routers for Cisco or Juniper or whomever. You bought a second Ethernet card and stuck it into your VAX or your Sun server or workstation or what have you, and you called that a router. And it was so easy to get the configurations wrong. No one knew what they were doing. There were no tools to help you. You configured it incorrectly, you could screw up the routing for the entire company. And that's what happened more than once. And so I started worrying about routing security. I started looking at other things that the general shape of the solution was pretty clear, but you couldn't afford to do lots of digital signatures. They were just too computationally expensive then. So I started looking at other aspects of security as well. At the protocol level, not so much here's a bug in a service, but here's a bug in the protocol specification. So my first major publication was basically protocol problems in TCP/IP that could lead to security problems.
Yeah, I feel like we don't talk about it with respects to TCP/IP. We don't talk about those enough today, and I would assume that they're still there, and especially in IPv6, correct?
Well, a lot of them are gone because of my efforts and many other people's efforts. When designing protocols, we now know what to look for. So back in the day, you wanted to do a quick, easy, passwordless connection between two computers, use the R shell or login commands, and that was basically IP address-based authentication, which the authors knew wasn't secure. Today, do the same thing with SSH, which is cryptographically authenticated. It's much more secure. I can go on and on like that, but most of the low-hanging fruit has been taken care of. The sequence number attacks in TCP, very hard to really fix that, though I outlined a mitigation for it. New protocols aren't susceptible because we've learned better. We can use encryption now, cryptographic authentication. Mm-hmm. So it's a lot better than it was way back when.
Joff, I have to imagine at this point you're really anxious to jump in, because this is your one of your passions and primary passions in security today is routing protocols and network security.
Well, it has been. I think first of all, it's a real honor to be talking to you, Steve. I've admired a lot of your work over the years, and I spent a long time in my career growing up as a system administrator and then network administrator as the industry pivoted, and then finally security. It's sort of a funny thing. Security, if you grew up in a Unix world, security was always in your back pocket. It's not like you ever forgot about it, because, in the world of the Unix space, we were always thinking about ways to exploit stuff. So it's really good to talk to you. But anyway, on the topic of questions, I think I'm really amazed, first of all, that and impressed that TCP/IP has been so robust over so many years. Do you have things that keep you up at night, that make you worry that, especially in the TCP world, as a fundamental protocol, that we have real concerns going forward?
The thing that scares me most is the thing that scared me almost 35 years ago, and that's routing security, and in particular BGP.
Yeah.
We know what to do. We have the BGP-SEC protocols defined. It's a question of getting it deployed, and that's a very difficult problem. And we don't have it deployed, and we need to. And there are reasons why it's not deployed, but more and more we're seeing real-world incidents where bad things are happening. There's even a forthcoming paper on using BGP attacks to get fake certificates from Let's Encrypt.
Yeah, so my sense is that most of the world, at least with the folks that I talk to, BGP is still a trust model between peers, between providers. And I think it's analogous, the BGP SEC issue. It's my sense that that's quite analogous to DNSSEC. It's sort of a mountain that we need to climb. It's going to take some time. What's your thoughts there in terms of timing on how to get it rolled out?
Well, I was part of the group that designed what's now the BGP-SEC protocols. And one of the things we did, we said, let's design it right. If it doesn't, we're not going to worry about running on existing gear. First, let's figure out where we want to be, then we'll figure out how we want to get there. And unfortunately, it's going to require new routers, because today's routers don't have enough RAM, don't have enough CPU capability to handle all of the signatures required. And the ISPs are mostly not interested. It's not just peer-to-peer trust, though. Someone 3 hops away can lie, and you're going to be deceived. And that's the problem with BGP.
Yeah, and certainly it's interesting to think that today the routers that we have aren't powerful enough to implement that. And you kind of reminded me, Steve, of implementing BGP. And every time I talk about it, they're like, yeah, you need to make sure you have a really fast router just to run it the way it is today. And so that overhead would force people to have to upgrade.
Yeah, it is. And we just said, this is what you've got to do. There's no other way to get it secure. So there are all kinds of options for partial security that we just threw out because we just didn't have any confidence that would really be secure. If we're going to do it, let's do it right. So we have the design. Now it's a matter of persuading people to implement it.
Steve, I want to change gears a little bit and go back in history to when, what was the driving force behind writing firewalls and internet security?
Well, the book actually happened by a couple of coincidences. That's a separate story I can get to in a minute. But the early 90s, there wasn't any way to do security on the internet. No one really understood what was going on. There were no firewall products. You had to roll your own. There were increasingly signs of attacks, and this was even before the web happened. So companies that were on the internet were already starting to see attacks in 91, 92. So something had to be done, and we had one of the first, not the first, but one of the first home-built firewalls. We decided to describe, here's what we did, here was our philosophy, here's how you can do it too. And the book came out just as the internet started to explode commercially.
And how did you get to know Bill Cheswick?
So Bill and I worked together at Bell Labs, and he was a sysadmin in research for the Unix room. Richie and Thompson and company were his users, and he was running the systems. I was in a different part of the labs, and we'd worked together on a couple of things. We didn't know each other that well, and by chance, we ended up on the train together to a Unix conference. And he mentioned he was thinking of doing a book, and we worked out the table of contents. Again, second coincidence, an editor who'd been stopping by office once a year for several years stopped by at just the right time. We came up with a good table of contents, and he said, good, this looks like a good book at the right time. So we sat down and we wrote it.
And how was it received by the community?
It was a bestseller. It came out again just as the internet exploded commercially, so a lot of companies suddenly needed it. And for about 6-8 months, there were no other books on the subject. I think it was a good book, but it had the distinct advantage of being the only book at a time when it was necessary. So it sold, the first printing sold out in about a week, the second printing in about a week and a half. So only the third printing we got a chance to put any fixes in to correct the numerous typos and so on. So it ended up being a bestseller by technical standards.
And how many revisions have you gone through since then?
Well, the fourth printing had fixed most of the typographic errors. There were probably a few more after that. 2003, we put out a second edition, but at that point, there were so many other books on the market that it wasn't nearly as good a seller. But the first edition, which, by the way, you can download freely online, though the internet's changed a lot since 1994. The first edition was a bestseller.
I think I'm holding a first edition.
You are indeed.
And it is actually signed. This is not my copy, if you can see that, but this is Jeff Mann's copy.
I recognize my signature in that.
There you go. Authentic signed copy.
In fact, I also had a digital autograph. We typeset ourselves. We digitally signed the files. I digitally signed it with PGP. I was handing out digital signatures of it, too, for a while.
That's awesome. So how has information security changed? What are in your mind, Steve, the major changes that have happened in information security since then?
Well, firewalls don't really work very well anymore because there's too much connectivity that's allowed through and around the firewall. We have to put much more stress on the endpoint. I'm not saying you get rid of the firewall. It still helps against the low-level attackers, the nuisance attackers, but there's much more on the endpoint. Your web browser, your mailer, these are seriously exposed to nasty stuff from the outside. And the security problems are at the application layer, and firewalls don't stop that. We wrote in that book that a firewall can only protect against attacks at the same layer at which the firewall is operating. If your attacks are at the application layer, you need an application layer firewall, and those are a lot harder to write because the applications today are so complicated.
Yeah, did it surprise you when we look at firewall companies today and where they are and the whole next generation and a lot of the inroads I think they have made into being a true application level firewall?
Well, they follow the growth of the network. I mean, the process. They've lost one of the advantages that we talked about, but it was necessary. The firewalls, if your threats are nasty, infected PDF documents or Word documents or Lord only knows Flash anythings on your web browser, if your firewall's not blocking that, it's not doing you a whole lot of good anymore. So you needed to move up. On the other hand, it means the firewalls themselves are far more complex than they were. In 1994, we could write that one of the advantages of a firewall is that it was so much simpler than a host. Modern firewalls supporting hundreds of different protocols and so on. It's no longer simpler. It may probably is even more complex, which raises an interesting question about the security of the firewall itself.
Right. Yeah, it was a huge win, I think, back in the day. If you could block Telnet from being accessed from the internet, right? Like that was huge strides there.
Yeah, absolutely. And all the other weird little things that you had to run.
Right. So, Steve, what sparked the idea for your latest book, Thinking Security?
Some of it grew out of a course that I teach, a course that I've been teaching since I became a professor in 2005. I'm trying to teach people how to think about the problem. Look at, say, the iPhone. It's about, 10 years old, 12 years old?
Yeah, 11, probably 11, yeah.
11. It changed the world. It changed the security world. It changed the way we do things. I'm morally certain that right now someone in Silicon Valley, in Bangalore, in Beijing, in Tel Aviv, in St. Petersburg, in some part of the world I've never even heard of, someone is right now designing and coding something that 10 years from now we're going to wonder how we lived without. How do you reason about this when you're a sysadmin in some company? Do I allow this on my network through my firewall? And if so, how do I protect against it? Because it's going to become absolutely vital. So that was one of the most I wanted people to think about. The other thing, the first chapter I wrote in that book was on authentication. There's so much mythology about passwords and other forms of authentication that I got tired trying to set people straight one at a time. So I wrote that chapter and realized that, okay, I was on sabbatical. Let me go write a book. And I did.
Nice. And so what are some of the misconceptions and lessons that you have for us on the authentication problem?
Well, it's now commonly accepted in the security community, though not necessarily among all practitioners, that the stress on strong passwords and changing them frequently is misplaced. What you want is never reuse a password. Almost all problems with weak passwords happen as the second security problem. Someone has compromised the site, stolen their password file, and is now guessing them. But you're losing passwords through phishing, through keystroke loggers. That's much... if I lose my password to a site because the site is hacked, if the site's hacked, they can do anything they want. What I need is a separate password for that site. I cannot remember 150 strong, unique passwords. Not humanly possible. So, unique passwords, random passwords, password managers. I don't have to worry about memorizing a password. My password manager does it for me. And changing it, no. When you change it, you force people to fall back on patterns, easily remember patterns, secondary authentication because they forgot their password, and more. So let's go for the real problem. Secondary authentication is much weaker than your password, typically.
Yeah, Can I go ahead. Sorry.
Oh, can I jump in there and ask a question, Paul?
Sure. Go ahead, Joe.
This is not on the authentication topic. I just want to roll back to firewalls just for a minute, but this question's been burning in my mind for years, frankly. So, Steve, how do you feel about the impact of network address translation technology, and can you contrast it in both a security and a operational context?
From an operational context, I really dislike it because it forces all kinds of weird workarounds and strange configurations to establish connectivity, especially when you get two companies, both of whom have decided to use 10/8 addresses internally, and now they need to set up a link between them. It's going to drive you absolutely bonkers trying to handle that operationally. From a security perspective, I originally disliked them, then I liked them. Now I think they're about the same as a packet filter. In the second edition of the Firewalls book, there's actually a detailed analysis of what they do and what they don't do. And it boils down to, if you can break through a packet filter, you can break through a NAT box and vice versa. And again, the problems attackers we're seeing these days are at the application layer. It doesn't matter. Someone's going to drop a 0-day through an infected attachment that you clicked on. You clicked on a URL you shouldn't. And once something's inside, it's going to go spread laterally internally and open an outbound connection through whatever firewall you have, whether it's NAT or application-based or what have you, to where they can control it. So it's useful against the low-level attackers. It's not solving the high-level. It's a network-level defense. Network-level firewall doesn't defend against higher-level attacks.
It's interesting, Steve, that you said that in a quick story. When I was working for a university, every single one of our student body had an actual internet addressable IP address. Every single student. And there was a lot of problems that caused.
Really?
I was part of the project that switched them to a go behind a network address translation device. And I think, to Steve's point, while we did solve some of the low-level, like low-hanging fruit security problems, we still had those other major security problems. But what we did solve was basically a lot of misuse by the students that were hosting all their own servers and basically exploiting that level of connectivity to do things that violated terms of service. To me, that was more of a major win than any security benefits to kind of along the lines.
Can I chime in on the end of that, Paul?
Yeah, sure.
So one of the things that's my pet peeve is network address translation technology in and of itself is an operational address savings mechanism. And this is my strongly held belief. But what you were really talking about, the thing that saved you was a stateful firewall. It had very little to do with the address translation.
Yes.
Yeah, that's correct. And the operational weakness is if somebody inside your organization is doing something nasty, all the outside has is the IP address. They may or may not be logging port numbers. If they are, you've got to go log the port number for every translation to be able to track down where it actually came from. And that's a real security operations nightmare.
Yes, that was a nightmare that I lived through as well.
Yeah, I don't work for the IT department at Columbia, but they actually have a very wide open philosophy. Everyone gets global addresses. In fact, you walk onto campus, it's a wide open Wi-Fi network, no registration or anything required. But they put a lot of effort into detecting and automatically isolating machines that appear to be infected or misbehaving on campus.
Yeah, in fact, I knew some of the security folks there at Columbia when I was working for a university as well, and that was very much their strategy. And I appreciate it because it's different from a lot of companies' strategies today. So,
well, a university can't control what people are running. If I want to run some weird open source operating system that I wrote myself, I'm allowed to. You can't, and the IT department cannot tell a professor what she or he can or cannot use for experimental gear. We do research, and what we need for research, the IT department can't control it. A firewall is a device for implementing policy. Years ago, the computer science department's chief systems person, after yet another security incident, said, I'm going to install a firewall and lock it down tight. And my question to her was, what policy will you enforce? Well, it'll be tight. What policy? I don't know. Well, if you don't know what policy to enforce, a firewall's not going to do you any good. The firewall enforces policy, it doesn't make it.
Steve, one of the quotes from the description of your book on called Thinking Security was, you wanted people to understand how to design security architectures that just don't prevent attacks wherever possible, but also deal with the consequences of failures. What are some things we need to think about to address the consequences of failures in our security design?
Okay, well, yeah, I won't say I've completely given up on preventing attacks and blocking them. I'd love to, but buggy code exists, and buggy code's at the heart of most security problems, and buggy code's not going to go away. So assume that some computer on your site is going to get penetrated. Now what? You've got to have a strategy for detecting this and coping with it. So you need intrusion detection, honeypots, logs, backups, internal segmentation, ways to recover. You want, in the wake of the Equifax breach, I saw statistics that the average site doesn't detect a penetration for 100, 120 days or something. Well, yeah, I find that very believable, but then the question is, why not? Why did you not detect this? Were you not looking for internal scanning, failed logins? Are you not looking at your net flow statistics to see why is this machine suddenly exporting a lot more data than it used to? And you want to, there's a more difficult question. How do you design your system architecture to be resilient against failure? That's actually a difficult thing to do. Well, give you my favorite example. Suppose you're running an e-commerce site. If every user's records were encrypted with their password, that includes their credit card numbers, encrypted with their password, someone who breaks in and steals that database, the speed of compromise is the speed of password guessing. And by the way, you've now given your users a really good incentive to pick strong passwords because it's protecting their own data. And that's different today, where one penetration exposes 145 million people's personal records at Equifax, or 50 million credit card numbers from Home Depot, or what have you.
Yeah, and it's secure. It goes back to one of my favorite lines from Sneakers, right? It's all about the information.
It's all about the information, Marty.
To do more to protect that is really what we're after in security, and not a lot of other things we do that really don't work.
Absolutely. Asymptotically, hardware is free. System administration costs money, but if you're doing it right, you're building tools and automating that. It's the information. That's the crown jewels. Back in the 90s, I heard of a site that had been hacked, apparently by a competitor who raised the prices on someone's website to drive customers to his own store. And that was more than 20 years ago.
So, Steve, you mentioned you are still teaching today. Is that true?
Yes, I am. So I love teaching.
What can we as security professionals do to encourage the next generation of hackers and or security professionals?
That's a good question. The one thing is to stop overreacting to people who find security problems in your products or your site. I mean, you don't want to prosecute people who report these problems, or even just publicize. You want to get this fixed. They didn't create the problem; they found it. You don't want to make people afraid to report problems, and your lawyers should be helping you secure your site, not going after the people who find the problems, because the real bad guys aren't going to report them. They're going to steal your 50 million credit cards.
In that sense, are you a big supporter of the bug bounty programs?
I think bug bounties are a useful thing. The real onus, of course, is on the system designers and programmers to build things more secure in the first place. But if you get that wrong, and no one gets it perfectly, bug bounties are a useful thing. There's that old saw about open source software, many eyes, with many eyes, all bugs are shallow. That's not true. It's got to be many skilled eyes who are actually taking a look at this stuff. A bug bounty program is a way to encourage people to take a careful look. Not a substitute for good design, but it's one piece of a much larger strategy.
along those lines, you mentioned open source software, Steve, and certainly in your experience in the industry, you've seen multiple evolutions of open source software. Do you ever look at where we are today with open source and just be amazed as to how far we come? Like Microsoft in its own cloud is something like 38% Linux machines. Like, did you ever think you'd see the day where people are embracing open source?
No, not to that extent. Open source in some sense goes way, way back. You go back to the 50s and 60s, and even through the early mid 70s, back in the days of mainframes, corporations would readily share software. Vendors like IBM didn't lock down and protect their software because software was not sold separately. It was just an adjunct to the hardware. It was all cooperative. So the open source spirit was there in the early days. Now, starting in the mid-70s, software started being sold. You get to the late 80s with PCs and start getting mass market software. And that's moving away from the open source spirit. And it came back as part of this cooperative spirit. And I think that's great. All that said, I'm leery of a lot of open source software because it has not been through the very difficult, time-consuming, painstaking security reviews, security architecture, security testing that companies like Microsoft do very, very well. Testing is a lot more boring than coding to many people. And Microsoft's got a security group that can look at a design and say, no, this is less secure than what we have now. You may not ship this. You can't do that in the open source world. And you need to.
Steve, one of my concerns with open source software today is due to the, I think, abundance of open source projects we have today that latch on to various different frameworks. As an organization, you might be using that open source software, you might be using a specific open source component that the author has really just given up interest in it or abandoned it altogether. How do we detect that that's happened? Because we'll never get a bug report, and that's kind of one of my greatest fears today with open source is there's so many projects, they're getting abandoned, no one picks them up, and we never really know if there's a vulnerability because if you report them, it goes nowhere.
It's a very serious problem with actually two different aspects to it. One is, as you say, all the abandonware out there. If you want to see if something's abandoned, just keep polling the repository. If you don't see any changes for a while, you can start worrying. The other problem is people, organizations who pick up some piece of software, build it into a product, and don't try to track it. We see that a lot with IoT, other embedded systems. You're frozen in time. Here's what this product looked like 5 years ago, and I haven't picked up a newer version. And that's something you can do something about. But the whole embedded system IoT world is a complete security nightmare for economic reasons, even places that want to do it right. But a lot of places don't even seem to be trying.
How did the IoT security come up from 2013 to 2015? You were a member of the National Research Council Study Committee for the FAA for the next generation of air traffic control systems. Some of these issues came up, and what can you share with that from that experience?
Well, air traffic control, aviation, that's a very different world. It's highly regulated. It's official projects, literally many billions of dollars worth of software. It's a very different world. Stuff is actively maintained there, but you need people who understand software security and software, and it wasn't always clear to us that they really understood what it took to secure software. One of the problems that the air traffic control system has is you have people flying in airplanes from other countries, but they're encouraged, required to be part of the air traffic control network. So you're not controlling an endpoint that's in the middle of your very sensitive operational network. And that's a risk, to put it mildly.
That's pretty cool. I had never considered that before. Yeah, that's really awesome. Steve, going back to your experience as a professor, what advice do you give students today that you think is like the biggest surprise to them or the most kind of outlandish in their minds when you provide advice about security?
Okay, well, my advice is not as direct. One criticism that we get, and I understand it, but I reject it, is we're not teaching people how to be hands-on day one. Why? Because 5 years from now, it's probably different. 10 years from now, it's definitely different. And I want to teach you how to think about the problems so you can go deal with the problems 10 years from now. So rather than saying, here's exactly how to configure today's version of Windows Server, today's release of Ubuntu Linux, I'll say, here are the kinds of things to look for. And I get some grumbling, but when I think back to everything I've seen and done over more than 50 years programming, you can't do it any other way. I'm trying to educate people, not train them. And I want to give them tools to pick up the manual, pick up the tools, and learn it themselves when something new gets shipped. The other thing, I warn people, this is not a static field. Things change, and you're going to have to adapt. You can't. You have to stay current. You have to affirmatively stay current. Track changes, even if you don't run any open source in your company. Follow what the open source world is doing because it's often a precursor to what someone else is going to ship. Find out what the industry trends are. Read the tech press, read blogs, just to stay current. Not that the old stuff's going away. I've seen some appalling statistics lately about how much COBOL is still in the world. But
Steve, along those lines, programming for 50 years, what's your favorite programming language been?
I don't have a favorite one. I don't do a lot of programming these days. Most of what I do these days is Python or Shell. Sometimes I'll write the occasional C program, but I haven't been an operational programmer for a long time. I write scripts for my own personal needs. My class websites, my blog are generated by Shell or Python scripts or combinations. But I strongly believe in matching the programming language to the task. Generally speaking, the higher level language you can use, the better. First of all, it probably solves a lot of the problems. It gets it done more quickly. And unless you're dealing with really crunch situations, CPU performance is probably not your bottleneck. And even if it is, you probably don't know just where in that program is your bottleneck. Code first, measure, then optimize. A mantra of mine for more than 40 years, I learned from Brian Kernahan at Bell Labs, and he's now at Princeton. And it's got to be the way to do things.
Paul, that's like asking like a family which one is their favorite child.
Exactly. Others on the panel, Jack, Jason, questions for Steve?
Oh, Jack's glasses are off.
I just wanted to thank you for joining us. I've been sitting here nodding, so I don't have a lot of questions, but it's refreshing to hear somebody that's been doing this longer than I have and have some observations about one of the challenges. One of the things you spoke to towards the end there was the fact that we have this challenge, and I often ask people what the value of knowing Win's replication is or how to harden an IIS-4 server, which I had to do in those days, but it doesn't move us forward as an industry. So I really enjoyed hearing you talk about that same issue. Because you must have seen it many more times than I have, where we do what we have to do today, but it doesn't move us forward in the big picture.
And Steve, along the lines of thinking about security, I picked this particular issue based on your background and a lot of things that are happening today, in that as encryption technology evolves, and certainly it's been evolving since the early days of PGP and even before that, how do we balance the good people who use it versus the bad people who are going to use it, and how do we continue that balance moving forward, knowing that as we build in these protocols that provide people with privacy, that bad people will use them to hide and good people will use them to protect themselves?
Okay, so moving to the realm, we're now moving into the law and policy realm. I actually spend a tremendous amount of my time these days on the law and policy side. Encryption technology, sometimes versus the government, is a battle I've been fighting for literally 25 years. And it's not that I don't like catching bad guys, I do, but I don't know how to provide for exceptional access while still having strong cryptography with high assurance. And every part of that is important. There have been many proposals for how to add, well, the neutral term's exceptional access. Jim Comey called it a golden key. Many people call it backdoor. It's a very, very, very difficult problem. It's already a very, very difficult field. Cryptography is an amazingly subtle field. And you start adding more features like this, you're likely to end up with a disaster. And I just don't know how to do it. I've seen proposals. I've never had any confidence that they were correct. Most of them look to be flawed, especially when you look at it from a systems perspective. Not just, here's how I encrypt a little bit differently, but the protocol, who has access to the keys, how do you protect it, how do you authenticate requests from a tiny constable in a tiny town in a country you've barely heard of. Does he or she have the right to access this encrypted device according to whatever legal system you want to enforce? It's really, really hard. So I prefer to go around the cryptography. I've written papers on lawful hacking, get the proper warrant and break into devices or communications, what have you. It strikes me, it's got its own risks, but it strikes me as a safer alternative than trying to tamper with the crypto.
Yeah, and one reference we had in the news recently was Ray Ozzy's proposal to basically backdoor the encryption and store those keys somewhere where law enforcement could then get a warrant to access them. Of course, there's a lot of issues with that, some of which you've already outlined.
Yeah, so his story is actually a very interesting one. He came up with his idea and started going around. He actually gave a presentation about a year ago to a small group that I was a part of, and we did not see any obvious immediate technical flaws, though the larger systems issues did very much concern us. He kept going around with this, and then in January he came to Columbia, again to present this to a small group, and a visiting scientist named Eran Tromer, visiting from Tel Aviv University, heard this presentation for the first time, and right on the spot, he found a way to exploit this, to let a bad guy break into a phone that was not supposed to be able to do. And I didn't spot, this meeting in May, I won't name the other people who were there, but they were brand name cryptographers, very famous people you've heard of. And none of us spotted this. And at this meeting in January, Iran looked at it sideways and said, oh, here's what you do. And the answer is, oh my God, that works. Certainly, there are assumptions. It's not something you could always do, but it was an unanticipated flaw when you started looking at it in a only very slightly broader context. And yet, that's the problem with these things. Cryptography is really hard to get right. I'll give you one last example on that. The Needham-Schroeder protocol is the oldest cryptographic protocol in the open literature. And they gave a variant, they gave a number of variants. They published this in 1979. 4 years later, a flaw was found. They thought about it, and 5 years after that, they published their fix. And they found a flaw in the fix. And then in 1996, 18 years after the original protocol was published, somebody found a new, previously unsuspected flaw in a protocol that in modern terminology would be about 5 messages and is blindingly obvious, I can explain it on the blackboard in 10 minutes to an undergraduate cryptography class. And it took 18 years to be noticed. This stuff is really hard.
That's pretty awesome.
Or not so much, depending on your perspective.
Depending on your perspective, certainly. Any more questions for Steve? Steve, we just have 5 silly questions to end the interview. Are you ready?
Absolutely.
3 words to describe yourself.
Computer and law geek. It's 4 words, but okay.
If you were a serial killer, what would be your weapon of choice?
I don't know. It depends on what kind of cereal you like.
Perfect.
If you wrote a book about yourself, what would the title be?
Thinking weird or thinking sideways.
In the popular game of Ask Grabby Grabby, do you prefer to go first or second?
Since I don't know the game, I couldn't tell you.
It's popular in Europe. Choose 2 celebrities to be your parents.
Alive, dead, fictional, or otherwise.
Well, that's interesting. Let's go for Lise Meitner and Thomas Jefferson.
Oh, wow.
Steve, thank you so much.
I would have not expected I expected a classy answer.
That's it. Yes.
And that is a classy answer.
Steve, it's been truly an honor to have you here on the show this evening. And we look forward to having our listeners go back and look at some of the things that Steve talked about and some of the things that Steve has done in his career. And if only could be a fly on the wall in your classrooms, rather, it'd be really awesome. And
can't do that, but all my slides are freely available on the net with the Creative Commons license.
There you go. Awesome.
Thanks for having me. I'll be happy to go tweet and blog the link to this video when it's up.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Steve.
Thank you.
And with that, we'll take a short break, come back, and hit our technical segment, so stay tuned.